We will be recording this, so I'll just take that off. And finally, we say this every meeting, we do have a benevolent fund, and to be fair, Amazon has been contributing to it. So if you go onto that www.smile.amazon.co.uk, and you do click on there, you buy something from Amazon, they will make a contribution to our benevolent fund, which people can tap into. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our main presenters today, Paul and John. Josh, so I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for that introduction. First of all, I've just got to say thanks for giving this opportunity for us to talk to you. As previously advertised, we're not going to do a PowerPoint presentation. We chose not to do that on purpose because through experience of presenting this rather interesting new technology, I think, well, hopefully, I don't want to be met by stony silence at the end, but it does generate quite a few questions, quite rightly. And I think probably the time is best used for us trying to answer your questions rather than boring you to tears about how good we think our particular piece of technology is. So what I'm going to do is going to be two parts to this, probably take about half an hour. I'm going to talk at you for a few minutes about who we are, what we do, and in particular, why we think what we've got is of interest to you in terms of its benefits. It's not going to be a sales pitch, I hope not. Then Josh is going to follow that up with a little bit of a brief introduction so you can see what I've been talking about, show you the product, explain a little bit how it works, and then hopefully, as I said, that will feed into some Q&A. I think we like to think of ourselves as either being, depending on your age, either the Ant and Dec or the Morecambe and Wise of the drug screening world. So you can judge yourself with that at the end, and you can guess who's who within that age brackets, especially. Right, okay, so intelligent fingerprinting. First and foremost, one myth to dispel. Looking at the name, you might think that we're something to do with fingerprint screening sort of technology, a bit like taking a fingerprint and checking your identity and comparing it against a police database or something like that. We're not. If there's one thing that we could change, it would probably be the company name. We are actually a provider of a way to take a fingerprint and to carry out a drug test from the finger. And so what I'm going to do is just explain a little bit about what drug testing is, why it's done, how it's done, and then a little bit about how we think that we've got something that's slightly different. Some of you may be already very aware of, so I apologize in advance. Some of you may be new to, so I'm going to explain a little bit, most of things from sort of first principles. So drug screening, as it suggests, what we're doing is we are collecting a sample from somebody, and we're taking that sample and we are doing a test on it, and we're getting some information that tells you about what somebody has taken recently. So what we have is what's called a point of care drug screening test. And that's different, I must stress that, from taking a sample and say sending it away like a hair sample to a laboratory where you wait maybe days or weeks or however to get a result. So it's an immediate indication as to what somebody may have been taking. What's the purpose of it, I guess, before we talk about what you can use to do a drug test? And there's two real main reasons when you're looking at this, certainly from the perspective of you guys. First of all, there's a general wellness perspective. So some companies will put in place drug screening to identify those people who may have a problem, who may be addicted to either alcohol or prescription or illegal drugs, and then that clearly is not helpful to them, not helpful for their performance, and not helpful to the company, so it can be implemented as a wellness. More likely, I would say, drug screening is implemented as part of a health and safety policy. So it's part and parcel of a document that is written, negotiated with the workforce to look at why drug screening is important, not just from a wellness perspective, but from a health and safety perspective. So it really focuses in on how, if somebody has either an alcohol or a prescription or an illegal drug problem, why they could be a danger to themselves, but also a danger to their colleagues and also a danger to the public or customers or whoever they're sort of working with. So there's no legislation from a national perspective. There's no law that says a company has to have a drug and alcohol policy. But there are a series of laws from the Health and Safety and the Drug Misuse at Work Act that do make it sort of quite compelling. And it's really about maintaining a safe workplace, keeping employees, customers and everybody safe. And at the same time, sort of establishing that deterrent. So if you're going to do or have a workplace policy, it's normal practice to support that with some degree of testing. And really the testing is there to monitor the effectiveness of the policy, but also to identify, as we said before, people who may be a health and safety risk to themselves. We can talk a little bit about the policies in a bit more detail if it's necessary, but there tend to be a number of reasons or a number of circumstances that people are drug tested. It can either be in a pre-employment scenario. So in particular, I guess at the moment, we do a lot of tests for, say, construction, logistics, those sorts of things where people are employing quite a lot of people at the moment, contractors, and you're really doing a drug and alcohol screen as part of the employment induction process. You then get sort of different types of tests that are done when people are employed. They can be what's called a post-accident test. So as the name suggests, somebody has an accident, there's a test to investigate was or were some contributing factors from maybe the misuse of drugs or alcohol that could have contributed to the accident. There's what's called a for-cause test, and that's where there's a reason to believe that somebody may have a problem. And so as part of the investigation of that, the person can be invited to give a drug screen. And then there's sort of random testing. And random testing can either be implemented across the entire workforce from the managing director downwards, or it can be targeted at different parts where there's a more tangible health and safety risk. So for example, some companies may do a sort of fitness for duty testing aligned at drivers, people that operate heavy pieces of equipment, those sorts of things. So if you're going to do drug testing in the workplace, what do you do? Well, there are different ways of doing the test. What you need, no surprise, is some sort of sample. And for the sort of test that we're talking about, so something that gives you an immediate result, you can do hair testing, that gives you something else that we can talk about separately. But for an immediate result that you can analyze there and then, you're really restricted to a body fluid. So I don't want to talk about body fluids so close after lunch, but if you think of body fluids, there are a different variety. There's blood, there's saliva, there's urine, and there's sweat. There are some others, like the fluid in your eyes, but I don't think you want to go injecting needles into people's eyes to do a drug test. And so when you look at those, the ease and the ability to take those is vastly different between them. So if you're going to want to, say, test for blood, you're going to have a nurse or a doctor or somebody that's qualified that's able to put a needle into somebody and take some blood out. So surprise, surprise, blood testing is very, very rare unless somebody has access to nurses and some sort of medical facility. So drug screening does tend to revolve around the collection of urine, oral fluid, or fingerprint sweat. So when you're looking at those, it then sort of boils down a little bit to how easy it is and how convenient it is, and some of the challenges that can be associated with collecting those samples. So for example, if you're thinking about urine, if you want to collect a urine sample, first things first, you need to have, because it's quite easy sometimes to cheat some drug tests. So quite often there'll be a requirement to have an observed sample collection. So if you're going to collect urine, you're going to need both gentlemen and ladies to collect from. Gentlemen and ladies, you can't really do anything other. So that builds in additional cost, additional sort of challenges into the sample collection procedure. You also need to assess things like the biohazardous nature of the sample. Some of the samples are more biohazardous than others, so they need to be treated with more respect, and they need to be discarded of as biohazardous waste. So what we have is an ability to do a drug screen from a fingerprint. And as Josh will show you in a minute, I think there's two things that really differentiate us from what I would call a sort of conventional urine or oral fluid drug screen that sets us apart and delivers some distinct benefits in terms of the sorts of things that we've talked about when you're thinking about why you should be doing drug testing. The first thing, as I've alluded to, is the ease of the sample collection. So you don't have to, as I alluded to before, have observed urine collections. You don't have to prepare sample areas to do the collection, like a toilet area. You don't need to make sure that people can't scoop water out of toilet cisterns or take water from taps. The sample collection itself is quick, it's immediate. For those of you that are old enough to remember the Martini adverts, you can collect the samples any place, anytime, anywhere. You can go immediately up to somebody wherever they are, indoors or outdoors, and ask them to give a sample. So that has an impact on two things, really. It reduces it's a lot more nice for the people that are giving the samples, which is important, but it's a lot easier for the person that's collecting the samples, both in terms of the things that we've talked about, but from a tangible perspective as well, it reduces the time, the effort, and the cost associated with collecting those samples as well. The other benefits of the system that we deliver, aligned to what we were talking about before, are connected to the feature of the drug test itself. Now, first thing to deal with straight away, a lot of you will be worrying about this is something new, it's something different. Is it completely different in terms of the accuracy of the result that it gives you? Now, all drug screening tests are, as the name suggests, drug screens. So for that test where you're collecting a sample and you're doing an immediate result, the overall accuracy is about 95%. And that sometimes surprises people because they think, well, wow, that means that if you do 20 tests, then one of those tests could give you a false result. Now, there's a reason for the accuracy only being 95%, and it's less to do with the technology and it's more to do with what we're testing for. Until the COVID pandemic, nobody really understood this term lateral flow. And when I used to say lateral flow test to people, they used to fall off their chairs and look at me and think, what are you talking about? Well, what we have is a lateral flow test. So the COVID test that you're used to using to test yourself for COVID is the same technology. Now, the COVID tests, the lateral flow tests, are not 100% accurate. And that's why if you get a positive, you then do a PCR test. We have the same system, and all drug screening technology companies have the same. So the drug screen itself is like the lateral flow test. And in the event of what we would call a screened non-negative, you then do a laboratory confirmation the same way that you do a PCR test for a COVID test. The main reasons why the tests are not 100% accurate is because you can take a substance that can give a result the same as if it's an illegal drug or a prescription drug or something that you're trying to test for. So the example I always use is heroin. So we can test for opiates, and opiates includes heroin, but it also includes the other opioid drugs that include some painkillers. So that somebody could be taking a prescribed opioid painkiller, like a codeine-based medication. You do a drug screen on them with anything, urine, oral fluid, or fingerprints or blood. You can get a screened non-negative from that sample. And that's why there's the need to have the laboratory confirmation, because that second sample is taken, goes onto the laboratory, and a bit like the PCR test for the COVID, it says unequivocally, yes, we've detected this, but it identifies specifically whether it's the heroin or whether it's the codeine from the drug test. So we provide that. We provide a screening test and a laboratory confirmation test, just the same. The second thing that's really different, apart from the ease of the sample collection and the non-invasiveness of the samples, is aligned to what we call the window of detection. And the window of detection is a term that some of you may have heard about before, but I'll explain what it means. If Josh was to take cocaine on a Friday night, I don't know whether he does or not, but if he was going to, then he would take the cocaine, that would go into his system, and for a while he'd be impaired. And then for a period after that, you'd be able to detect the fact that he'd taken that cocaine. The way the drugs tests work, all of them, ours included, is we look for a combination of what's called the parent drug, cocaine, with what we call the metabolites. And the metabolite, as the name suggests, is your body's metabolism of that substance. everything gets metabolized, gets digested. So for cocaine, and there'll be a test at the end, cocaine is metabolized into a drug called benzalkylene. Everything in drug screening is shortened to a 3-letter acronym. So cocaine gets shortened to COC, cocaine. Benzalkylene, the metabolite of cocaine, gets shortened to BZE. So the drug test looks for a combination of cocaine and BZE. Now, if you were to take samples from Josh when he'd taken that cocaine, blood, fingerprint, sweat, urine, and oral fluid, and you tested them for the hours and the days afterwards, you would find the times that you detected the use of that drug would be massively different. So for the first thing that would appear would be in the blood, but then it would disappear in a few hours. The next thing to appear would be fingerprint sweat, but it would disappear after about 14 to 16 hours. Then the oral fluid would appear, and it would disappear in terms of it being able to be detected after about a day to 2 days. And the last thing to appear is urine, but it's detectable for 2, 4, even longer days, longer with very, very sort of habitual use of cannabis in particular. Why is that important when you're thinking about drug screening in the workplace? And what it really boils down to then is the purpose for why you're doing the drug screening. And when I talked about people writing policies, what the purpose of the policy is, in particular when you look at the drug screening. Now, we work with a lot of companies, we've implemented drug screening, and what I tend to find is that most workplace drug policies focus on fitness for duty. So what I mean by that is, if you take that scenario with Josh, he takes cocaine on a Friday night. If you, say, used a urine or an oral fluid test to test Josh on a Monday morning, you would get a screen non-negative that would go to a laboratory and be confirmed, because you're still picking up the use of that cocaine on a Friday night on a Monday morning. You wouldn't get a positive and non-negative result if you used blood or fingerprint sweat, because the windows of detection are too short, because with blood it would be gone within a few hours, and with us, going into sort of Saturday lunchtime, you wouldn't detect the use of the cocaine. So that has really two effects in terms of a policy and in terms of the testing results from a policy. It means that when you use something like fingerprint sweat, you actually reduce the numbers of positives that you get, but you are prioritizing the positives on those people that have most recently taken the drug that you're screening for. Now, another myth to dispel, which you may hear other people talk about when they talk to you about drug screening, is that you can link a drug positive to somebody being impaired, and that's not true. Because it's like most people are familiar with alcohol, and you'll know that some people, like Josh, can drink about 8 pints and he's fine. If I have a half a shandy, I fall over because I'm not very used to drinking it. So impairment is not really linked just to taking the substance. It's linked to how often you take something, how familiar you are with it, and those sorts of things. But the critical thing is, the shorter the window of detection, you know that they've taken that substance more recently, so the higher the link there is to the chance that they're going to be impaired. So again, what you're doing is, through fingerprint testing, is you're focusing on those people that are most recently taken a substance and are most likely to have a risk of being impaired. Now, when we were sort of looking at our product that we were selling into the workplace, we also looked at the Trade Union Congress guidance on drug testing in the workplace. And when you look at it, it looks like it's been written by us. And I promise you it hasn't. But the Trade Union Congress talks about their guidance, talk about, if good practice for workplace drug screening, there's a few things to consider. The first thing they talk about is the non-invasiveness of the sample. So the thing that we talked about before. So you should be using the least invasive sample that you can. So, avoiding putting people through the indignity of giving urine samples and those sorts of things. Make it a nice, clean, easy sample to collect. The second thing they talk about is this window of detection. So they talk about doing something that's focused on really detecting people that have just recently taken the drug, so they're at more of a risk of themselves, not fit for work, and possibly impaired through the drug use that they've taken. And the other thing they talk about is the range of drugs that you detect. And they talk about focusing in on a smaller range of drugs that there's a realistic chance that somebody is going to be have used it. And to illustrate that, I always use an example of, if you look at there is many drug screens on the market that you can screen for, say, 10, 20, however many drugs that you want to. And when you look at that, it'll include things like heroin, cannabis, cocaine, methamphetamine, ecstasy, those sorts of things. But it'll also include things like a drug called PCP. And I challenge anybody, unless you were in the American Air Force in the 1970s, to know what PCP was. PCP is a drug called phencyclidine, or otherwise known as angel dust. And it was literally a drug that was abused in the 70s, a bit like LSD. But it's become one of those things that, because it was tested 4 years ago, people still think they need to test for it. And what the TUC said, why test for things like that? Concentrate on things where there's a realistic chance of you getting a positive. So we've done that as well. We've narrowed down what we test for, just to test for the sort of things like the things I talked about before: heroin, ecstasy, cannabis, cocaine. So that hopefully gives you a bit of an introduction as to what we are, who we are, what we do, and why hopefully it's of some interest to you. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Josh, and he'll wake you up by showing you a little very brief overview as to what it does.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so I do apologise, I might go a bit QVC on everybody, but it's a bit of a show and tell. So as Paul mentioned, there's no special preparations needed to take this test at all, which is already sort of hands in the time side of it. So the first things first is we're basically a 3-part test. Okay, so I'll just run through it quickly. So you've got cartridges, which look like this, come in a box of 25. On the back, you've got what drug groups we screen for. So Paul's touched on it earlier. So it's the main drug groups in today's society. So opiates, methamphetamines, cocaine, THC. The second part is the reader. So the reader looks like this. It's handheld, it's got a battery life of 6 to 8 hours, stores up to 300 results. I mean, I've got a bit of a big head, but just to give you an idea on size as well, it's smaller than my head, and it's portable, so it allows you to test in any location. And then the last part is the confirmation side. So as Paul sort of touched on, the screening test is 95% and upwards accurate, but for 100% accuracy, and also to rebuff your chain of custody, and if you are ever legally challenged as a business, it's best practice to send a second and a third sample back to lab if you have an initial non-negative on a screening test. So first things first, with regards to special preparations, we'd always say, give the donor a choice of 3, have that element of randomness when you're asking them to take the test. So whether you open the box and let them choose or have them laid down, there's no particular special preparations needed. All we're going to do is a quick check of the hands. So we're just going to make sure that there's no blockages, there's no open wounds, because we're going to need 10 samples, so 10 fingertips on a pad. So if, for example, I had, I don't know, a plaster on this finger, I just do this finger twice, as long as there's a buildup of 10. For obvious reasons, people are using hand sanitizers, anti-bac gels, creams, etc. at the moment. We've stress tested the test. They do not affect it at all on that front. Okay, so the actual packaging looks like this. I don't know if everybody can see this because it's in Zoom, but on the front, you'll just have, again, information about what drugs we screen for. Just to confuse everybody, you've got the date in American format there. So it is worth getting a donor just to read the date back to you, because the reader itself won't run an out-of-date cartridge. You've got some information there about what the lot number and our product code. And then there's some more information there just on the drug groups again. So what we do is get the donor to actually open the test themselves. And you'll have a cartridge which looks like this. So on the cartridge itself, we've got a buffer clip here, which has got a liquid with antibodies in. You've got your sample pad here. So this is where we're going to get our 10 samples. You've got a tamper-proof clip here, which slides across and protects the sample once collected. And then you've got your control lines here. Okay, so as Paul mentioned before, it is a lateral flow test. On the back, you've got a place for the donor to, we normally say for GDPR, you put, if you had like an employee reference number as opposed to a full name, a place for them to sign and a place for them to date as well. And then you've got some more information again about what drugs we screen for. So once we've done the check of the hands, I'm going to just move everybody down. So hopefully everyone can see that. All we're going to do is just press down on the pad for 5 seconds on each finger. And as you can see, whilst I'm pressing down, you can actually see the change in color in the nail. So with ourselves, there's no reason not to give a full sample. Okay, so the only way to cheat this test, shall we say, is to hover your finger like so and not press down. If you found that somebody was doing that, you could just get them to press down with their other finger. If, I felt like wearing nail varnish today and you couldn't see my nail, you can still see the crease in skin. I'm not going to encourage anyone on the call to Google how to cheat a urine test or how to cheat a saliva test, but if you do go online, there is a lot about it, obviously because people have been trying to get around it for a long time. With ourselves, as I said before, everybody sweats, and there's no reason not to give a full sample. It is worth mentioning as well, this can all be administered from 2 meters away. So we didn't design the product to fit, with COVID or work in a safe and social distance, but you can all do that. So you can visually see if somebody's completing a test correctly. So once we've done 5 seconds on each finger, we're just going to slide the tamper-proof clip across like so, and it slots into place like that. And that is literally a sample collection done. So it takes less than a minute to collect a sample, as opposed to, 10 minutes for a saliva test, or how long does it take somebody to go to the toilet for a urine test. So there's no, delay on that front. Once we've collected the sample, I'm going to switch the reader on, which will come up with 4 options. So you have single test, batch test, review results, and settings. Now, review results and settings are both password protected. Reason being is the reader stores up to 300 results. So for GDPR, you don't want anybody being able to log in and access your results. Settings, it is important that the time and date are correct, because if you are ever legally challenged, they'll never challenge the end result. They'll challenge the process that you've taken to get to that. So it's important that that marries up for your chain of custody side of things. Batch testing we'll get into, but we're going to do a single test. So I'll try and do this upside down. Press single test, and it will talk you through what to do. So it'll say press the buffer clip, which we'll do. And you should hear a firm click. And then you should see like a black line start to appear. So, I mean, Paul is actually a doctor, so he could probably give you a more scientific explanation as to what's now happening. But I'd always say that the antibodies are running across the pad, grabbing hold of any drugs, and now they're taking them to the control lines, which will then be analyzed by the reader. Okay, so once we've done that, we'll go next on the reader, and it literally talks you through what to do. So it will say insert cartridge, which we'll do, and it will say reading cartridge. Now, on the back of every single one of our cartridges is an RFID tag, which basically just introduces itself into the reader, explains what drugs it's actually screening for, and it also makes it easily sort of traceable through manufacturing as well. So you'll be greeted with this screen. So the information that you put on the back of the cartridge, i.e. the donor ID, you just pop there. The good thing about this is if you was in a rush, for example, and you tried to go past the screen without popping a donor ID in, it knocks you back. So the reader will always prompt you on what to do at each stage of the test. Okay, so we understand that with our test, you would be doing it in-house, so you don't want a fiddly test to do. You want a simple test. So we'll press start test, and then you'll be greeted with this analyzing sign here. Okay, so effectively what happens now is the test itself, I always say it incubates for 9.5 minutes. So when I say incubate, I always think of like a chicken and an egg, but there's no heat involved whatsoever. So all that's happening is those antibodies are developing. They develop for 9.5 minutes, and then 30 seconds after that, there's a fluorescent camera which is built into the reader, which will take a picture of the control lines, and it will give you a result from that. So for one test, to test one sample, it will take you a total of 10 minutes, but that's just for the one test. Okay, so that is on a single test. We have an option which is called batch testing. So batch testing is really good. I know Paul kind of touched on it previously about pre-employment side, or if you want to test large groups of people. So for one test, it would always take you 10 minutes, but batch testing allows you to test up to 6 people in 15 minutes, okay? How do we do this? It is the same process with regards to sample collection. So it's 5 seconds on each finger for up to 6 people. The only difference now is once you've collected all 6 samples, we're then going to simultaneously press these buffer clips. So we're going to press them one after another, okay? We then insert the first one into the reader, which would still do the whole 9.5 minutes incubation time, last 30 seconds, take a picture. But because you've simultaneously pressed the remainder of the samples, you've effectively activated the test. So what these are now doing is these are all incubating outside of the reader. So in batch test mode, the reader knows just to do the last 30 seconds of each sample as opposed to the whole 10 minutes. So it really can cut down your testing time. So if, we speak to a lot of customers that maybe want to ramp up their testing or do a big random group of people, it can really cut down your testing time, which links in again to obviously saving time on that front. So that's batch test mode. The last part of the test is if you get a non-negative. So as Paul kind of touched on before, if you get a non-negative, it's best practice to then send it back to the lab to be confirmed. Now, we provide these confirmation kits. In the kit itself, if I can get it open, we have a tamper-evident bag, which is the first thing that the lab will check. Again, these are all parts to rebuff your chain of custody. You've got a free post envelope, which goes back to our UCAS accredited lab in Cambridge. You've got some bubble wrap to put everything in and protect the sample, unless you're like me and you like popping it. Everything that goes back to the lab is completely anonymous. So you've got some barcodes to affix to everything so the lab know whose sample is whose. And then we've now got 2 screening cartridges this time. Okay, so the screening cartridges look slightly different. Sorry, the screening cartridges for the back to lab look slightly different to the standard screening cartridges. So there's no buffer clip, there's no control lines. You've still got your tamper-proof clip here, and the pad's slightly shinier. On the back, you've got first and second. So the lab will ask for 2. The reason being is they will analyze one straight away and they'll freeze the second one. So as a business, if you are ever legally challenged on that sample, your test can be brought back out and they can reanalyze it. So it's almost as a keepsafe for you guys as a business. Okay. The actual collection of a second and a third sample for this is practically the same as the screening test. The only difference now is we're now going to ask the donor to wash their hands and let the sweat build up for 15 minutes and then take the test. And there's a couple of reasons why we do that. The first reason is, as Paul discussed, our screening test is 95% and upwards accurate, okay? But the cutoffs within our screening test allow for background levels of drugs in day-to-day society. So whether it be cocaine on banknotes, cannabis residue on public transport, that sort of thing, you won't get a non-negative on a screening test for that because the cutoffs will have allowed for that. But with the test that goes back to lab, it is a lot more sensitive, and to negate any argument from the donor, for example, of I've touched a hard drug, not that you should be touching a hard drug at work, but I've touched something, what we ask is that they wash their hands like the NHS have told us to do a surgical scrub, let the sweat build up for 15 minutes, and then give a second and a third sample from there. Okay, that is then seen as a clean sample. Once that 15 minutes is going on as well, you're not just aimlessly staring at the donor. You have got consent pads that come with the equipment. So again, you just be reading through what the process is with the donor and gaining their consent. On the pad as well, you've got places to put what time the donors wash their hands, what time you've taken a test, which would always have 15 minutes in between. You've also got a box here to put if the donor's on any medication at all, what dosage, etc., and a place for them to sign. With these consent forms, you've got one for the donor, one for your own records, and then the one that goes back to the lab, as we mentioned, everything that goes back to the lab is completely anonymous. So all the donor's details are grayed out here and here, okay? As we said, so you do 5 seconds on each finger for 2 samples. You pop everything in the bag, you send it away to our lab. So our lab is a UCAS accredited lab, as I mentioned before. There's eyewitness trained staff there. Samples can be observed if necessary, if somebody really wanted to come in and watch it. We set you up with what's called a secure web portal. So you get a notification. It will take around sort of 3 to 5 working days. I'd also get a notification to let you know that your results are in. You then log onto the portal and be able to view results from that front. And that is us in a nutshell. The last part would be just on the screening test. Once it comes with a printer, which I've got plugged in, but I won't show you. The printout looks like this. So you'll have just a definitive even on what drugs we've screened for, whether it was a negative. It's a 4-panel test, the lot ID, the donor ID, and then you'll also have here last calibration date. So the reader itself needs to be calibrated either once a month or every 400 tests, and it will prompt you when it needs to be calibrated. It comes with a calibration cartridge that will insert. All you have to do is insert into the reader for 30 seconds. It self-calibrates, and then you're good to go again from there. We do actually send you a new one out completely free of charge every 6 months as well. And that is us, Paul. So does anyone have, well, I'm just going to open it up, but does anyone have any questions? I hope so.
Has this been tested before? Has this been, what type of businesses are you currently with? And what's the feedback from the businesses?
Paul, maybe Paul, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. It's not very helpful, is it, when you're muted? We've been on the market for a couple of years, and so we've been selling for that sort of time. We haven't really targeted any specific businesses. We really wanted to see where the product was best received. I think after having been on the market for a couple of years, I think, as I said in my sort of introductory talk, I think we always thought that it would be more focused on where there was a defined health and safety benefit, and I think that's sort of proven to be true. So we have a lot of customers in construction, logistics, distribution, manufacturing, those sorts of things. We have a customer testimonials. I shouldn't be naming people on this without their consent, really, but if people are interested, we have we compile a list of customer testimonials, but we've got, let's say, national construction companies, those sorts of national sort of manufacturers, those sorts of things. So it tends to be where there is a little bit of a defined health and safety need, I would say. Would you agree, Josh?
I would, yeah.
Thank you.
100%.
Sorry, I'm taking over a little bit and I'll hand it out in a sec, but can you do a retainer type service in terms of some companies don't want, regular testing, but if they find someone who they suspect to be under the influence, they can call you in, etc., to do those one-offs kind of thing. Is that the type of service you offer?
It's a good question, Tony. And what we found was, again, because other companies offer that, and the reason they offer it is because their tests are quite difficult to get to grips with. So nobody wants to be collecting urine samples and even oral fluid samples. And because of all the things that we talked about, having the training, having the preparation, all that sort of stuff, it makes it easier sometimes for people to say, well, I'll get a third party to come in and collect the sample. What we found through experience is when we go through what we've just done today and we show people how the test works, it's so easy that people do it themselves. So even if you're only doing very few tests, we train people up. We do a train the trainer course so that people can cascade the training. We have a sort of customer support function. So it's not a problem. So when we've offered it for people to use it, they don't want to because they say, well, we'll do the tests ourselves.
And has this ever been challenged? Have you ever been to IT, Industrial Tribunal, and have you ever had that level of challenge to say whether?
Yeah, and that's another really good question. And my background was in forensic science. I used to work for the Forensic Science Service for many, many years. And of course, that was all about the court system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When, I think Josh may have mentioned it, I don't think I did, when a test is challenged, what they're really trying to do is to blow a hole in the process. Yeah. Because that's the easiest thing to do, and that's the way that they get forensic science sort of things chucked out of court. So what we've done is we've done everything that we conceivably can do to make sure that the process is as robust as possible. And a lot of that is common sense. So it's things like Josh talked about, having tamper-evident bags, having a tamper-evident cover on the cartridge, using barcodes, using all that sort of stuff. Now, when people ask whether we've been legally challenged, there's two ways to answer that. Yes, we have, and nobody has been successful. And I think that's for me, is really pleasing. And also, we are very rarely challenged. Now, you may think that's a bad thing, but actually, I think that's a good thing, because if I've had a test and I'm disgruntled about the result, then I go and talk to a solicitor and say, well, I'm going to challenge this test. What they do is they do what we've just talked about. They look at the process, they look at the science, they look at what we do, and then they go back to their client and say, you're wasting your time. Because there's no way, this is done, we've got all the right kite marks. We're ISO 13485 medical devices accredited. The laboratory we use, Josh mentioned it, is UCAS, which is the international standard for forensic labs. Our laboratory additionally has ISO 17025, for those of you that like your ISO numbers. And again, that is the forensic science standard. Josh mentioned it. The scientists that do the tests are expert witnesses. So that means, like the Forensic Science Service, they can give scientific opinion in court. So we've done everything we can to make sure that in the event of a challenge, we are as robust as we possibly can, and the proof is in the pudding. Touch wood. So far, we've had very few challenges and nothing that's been successful.
Thank you. Sorry, Will and Leslie. Yeah. Michelle's here.
All right, we've got a question in, Tony. We've
Hey?
had a question in from Heather Woodman.
Oh, great.
Yeah, just in terms of positive results, are positive results found at all levels of the company? That's for Josh.
And the answer to that is an absolute yes. I think you may have seen in the news, there's been quite a lot of focus on it through the pandemic. I think drug use has sort of gone up a little bit in the pandemic, as has alcohol use, as we've all been sat at home self-isolating. But irrespective of that, if you look at drug use trends, we look at our own data, and you look at data that's published by people like the European Centre for Drug Addiction Monitoring, what you find is, sadly, that drug use is not age dependent, it's not class dependent. Any measure that you can apply to it, it's not dependent upon. It is, sadly, people get addicted to drugs and alcohol for a whole raft of different reasons, and it's very rarely linked to one particular thing. So for sure, we get drug positives from across the board. We get senior managers testing positive right the way across the company. What we do tend to find in terms of the sorts of drugs, sort of ties into what I said really. Our 4 main drugs that we screen for, taking on the advice of the TUC, is opiates, which includes heroin, cannabis, cocaine, and methamphetamine, which includes ecstasy. I'd say that 3/4 of the positives that we get are from cocaine. Cocaine, from my perspective, from looking at this, has become the alcohol of the 21st century. It seems to be that the use of cocaine seems to have been looked upon as almost like it's no worse than alcohol. I think if you look at the effects of cocaine on people that take it and their future when they get addicted to it, I would strongly argue it's significantly different to alcohol. The other positives that we get tend to be in cannabis, so it tends to be the fit mix between cannabis and cocaine.
Okay, brilliant, thank you.
Bill, just a quick question then.
Yeah.
We have drivers where we are, and there's prescribed drugs for drivers to be under the influence of. Do you not test for those?
They will impact, most of the prescription drugs that are going to have an impact on somebody whether they're able to drive tend to be these ones that I alluded to. Like when I don't know if they even sell Night Nurse anymore, but Night Nurse used to have a warning on it saying, do not take this and operate or drive. And a lot of medication has those warnings on them. And they tend to be things that contain opiate-based drugs. So all these all-in-one, in particular cold and cough remedies, they have things like paracetamol to kill the pain, but to make you feel better because you're feeling rubbish, they'll put some opiates in there as well because it makes you feel a bit more jolly. And it's those sorts of things that will have an impact on people's ability to drive. If you look at the drug drive legislation for the UK, half of the drugs are illegal and half of them are prescription based around the sorts of things that we're talking about. So the short answer to your question is, yes, they probably will be picked up, but because they're being declared, when they fill in that form that Josh talked about, as part of the process, you ask the person to declare anything they're being prescribed or they're taking over the counter, and the lab take that, they will report that back. So if there's a contribution from a prescribed medication, but you as a company monitoring it, I'd be as equally worried if somebody's drinking a bottle of Night Nurse and going out to drive a lorry as if they're taking cocaine, because they're still going to be potentially a danger to themselves. So, the policy's there to detect people that are really a risk to themselves and others. And
Seema, Zach Williams has taken the next question right out of my head. Are there some drugs that are present in sweat for longer than others? E.g. cannabis can be in the hair for a long time after use. We had someone who went to Holland and had the space cake at the weekend, came back and tested positive on Monday. So they took it legally. Doesn't say they were unfit when they were at work, but still they got tests on them. So where's the fairness in this?
Yeah, and you're right. And that is an issue. It's a particular issue with cannabis and urine testing as well. Some of you may have heard this, and it's true. If somebody is a regular user of cannabis, going a bit scientific on you for 10 seconds, I talked about the metabolites, and the metabolites are stored in the body in different places. Cannabis metabolites get stored in the body fat. And if somebody is a regular user, they get a buildup of the metabolites in the body fat. So even if somebody is a regular user and they stop, if they're a really regular user, you could detect their cannabis use a month later because the metabolites slowly come back out of the system. Our system, thankfully, we don't suffer from any of that. So we don't suffer from the hair thing. We don't suffer from the body fat thing. We had to do a series of experiments in the US called Pharmacokinetics Studies, where we took people, dosed them up in a laboratory type condition, not with the real drugs, but with things that were similar to the drugs, and then looked at the detection times. And we find that almost all the drugs that we detect for come out around this sort of 14 to 16 hours. There's a little bit of variation, but the variation is more to do with the things we talked about before. When you look at that window of detection, it's a little bit more variable on what they've taken, how much they've taken, and how frequently they've taken it. Also, just to muddy the water a little bit more, it can be a little bit variable depending on how old they are, their BMI, and their sort of metabolic health. But that's not going to significantly change. It just changes maybe an hour sort of either side sort of thing.
Can I hand over to Michelle? Sorry, Michelle, are you there?
Hi, Tony.
Hiya.
Hi, Paul and Josh. Well, thank you so much for your time in the presentation. That was really, really interesting. And I must just say, I've got a couple of questions I'll touch on now, but I was cringing through some of that presentation because previously working in a large civils organisation, I was subjected to the drugs and alcohol. We had a random, I think 15 of us were tested. I think over a few weeks you basically got in and were segregated and then went through the testing, and it was breathalyzer for alcohol testing and also the urine sample. And it wasn't a good experience, put it this way, because the area that they chose, so they'd segregated the guys and the girls, if you like, in the separate respective toilets, and they were all sealed up. But I literally had to do a walk of shame past all of the guys holding my sample into where the lady was sitting to conduct the testing and things. So it wasn't a pleasant experience at all. So I can see moving on to this, it certainly pleased me. I think, you know, some of the questions that have come up from people are about costs and things. So if you're a business and you're thinking of implementing this, are the costs comparable to doing, you know, the other tests for the urine and things?
Yeah, we benchmark. Again, it's fine for us to sit here and say we think the test is the best thing since sliced bread, and there are some, you know, distinct benefits. I think there are some distinct benefits, as you've just said, and the other things that we talked about. But equally, we understand that if we're wildly off the mark in terms of costs in this day and age, it's going to be a non-starter. We're not the cheapest. You know, if you want to buy some really cheap urine tests, you can get them off the internet, but you'll probably get what you pay for, if you get what I mean. So we're a sort of premium product when you compare us. We're sort of similar to oral fluid tests, are a bit more expensive than urine tests, but we do have a flexible pricing structure. I'm sure everybody says this, but we have the same. So we don't have a one size fits all. What we like to do is we like to sit down with a company and say, okay, what are you trying to achieve? How many, you know, what sort of policy have you got? How can we best provide something that fits what you're trying to do in terms of your policy, but also your budget? And so we sort of try and, as far as we can, sort of put a proposal together that sort of fits and ticks the boxes for both. The proof's in the pudding. I say we'll send you the customer testimonials if you're interested. You know, there are people that are taking it on because they see the benefits of what we do, and they outweigh maybe the fact that we're slightly more expensive than some of the cheaper tests.
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions there. So I know that's on people's lips, if the cost is important, isn't it, to, you know, the delivery of these areas. So I think that's been a topical question. So we'll have your details, I think, anyway, when we've done the presentation. There's a question there on the chat. I think Michael Ford asked a really interesting question. if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, just so I don't get mixed up in what you're trying to get out of the answer. You there, Michael?
I am, Michelle, thanks. Yeah, I'm used to the drug testing regime in safety critical sector in rail, but obviously working in industries that are non-safety critical, one of the things I'm seeing is individual companies now looking to introduce this type of testing, but that can detect a change in terms of conditions of employment. I just wondered, where do you start with something like that? Because it's quite an emotive subject. And working internationally, I know there's some countries we can't even talk about it, like the Netherlands and places like that. And I just wondered how you would start in the UK.
Yeah, and it is a good question, Michael. At the end of the day, it comes down to this policy that we've talked about, because there's no, you can't force this on anybody. Quite rightly, I wouldn't like it forced on me, and it's not right that you force this testing on anybody. But it comes down to looking at the reasons why a company wants to do this, and actually talking to the unions, talking to the employees, and sort of working out what is a sensible response to that. When you go through that process, and it's a bit like looking at the TUC guidance, it really does come down to wellness and health and safety, and trying to put a policy together that sort of fits that. And you do find then, I've had quite a few sort of discussions with unions in particular, when on the face of it you think, oh no, this is going to be a nightmare, nobody's going to want to do this. But when we talk through the sorts of things that we've talked about, and we talk about, okay, you're going to do this, why are you going to do it? You're trying to create a safe environment, you're trying to improve people's health, you're trying to protect people from themselves, and also protect colleagues from people that may be at risk, and also the customers as well. Then it actually, from my experience, it turns out to be quite not an easy process, but quite a straightforward and productive thing. And you end up with a policy that sets out what's needed to be done, that then is quite palatable to be sort of signed up to. In particular, again, flying the flag for us, because we tick those extra boxes of being very non-invasive, having a short window of detection, so a very strong link to fitness for duty, not penalising people for what they're doing in their when they're not at work, and we detect for this smaller range of drugs. So from that perspective, it makes the whole process a little bit easier. I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's not as hard as you may think it is going to be. But at the end of the day, yes, you do need to change the policy, and you will need to negotiate that with the unions and the workers.
Is that okay, Michael?
Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
So one thing I'd also say, I've had experience of working for those large civils outfits, and the way that it was explained to me when we transferred from a local authority, if you like, to the civil engineering side. These were all things that previously hadn't really been communicated to staff. This was something that we all had to buy into as employees. And the way that it was channeled was through their management of occupational road risk. So if you've got a workforce of 200 for argument's sake, and they're driving vehicles around, and they're going to customers' homes, or they're going to sites where they're going to operate HIABs, they operate machinery, they're picking up pallets of materials, they can straddle the footway, they can be, having cars next to them. These guys are highly trained, and from a health and safety point of view, the assurances from those businesses when they're doing this regime of testing, that they're not putting anyone at risk, whether it be the person, the colleagues, the people who they're working with, should there be a slippage on a sling or anything like that. And it's really important that people realise, if you are in control of that environment, why would you not do the testing? Why would you not have that assurance that those individuals who you're handing the keys to, of these massive vehicles that could, in a collision cause, serious damage, any slippage of the materials or anything like that. If you've got someone who's under the influence of alcohol, drugs or whatever, they're putting members of the public at risk. They're putting, my children at risk if I'm walking a child to school and somebody's driving past us in the roadway and they've been under the influence. I think it's really good for those businesses that if they've qualified, there's an operational road risk side of things, why would you not write it into your policy? And anybody who wasn't a fan of signing up to that, then you'd be asking those questions. I certainly would as a health and safety practitioner. So I know that there are some of the businesses that you do, you know, target, because that's obviously part of their management of the occupational road risk. Their employees sign up for it, and it's to be expected as part of your duties that you could come under that regime of testing. I think from the policies that I've seen over the years, a lot of them do tend to have companies like yourselves on a standby basis where they will have with cause. So after the event of an incident, we'd make a phone call, a person would be sent to site, and the tests or samples would be taken there and then. And also they do a series of random, you know, quite random testing. The staff are all aware that it could happen at any time, and it's managed by the managers and the people like yourselves, the professionals that come in. But I think it was really interesting how you said before that it's that easy to do, that you could do like a self-delivery package for people. So I think that's something that, you know, if people want to get in touch with you over that, I think, you know, sometimes if you've got staff on site and there was an incident, the clock starts ticking, doesn't it, when there's an incident on, you know, that testing and you know, as you said before, the impacts of drugs and alcohol can wear off over time. So if we're waiting for someone to drive, you know, 6 hours to get to us, the effects of that test may wear off. So I'd say that's just drawing on some experience that I've had in the past, being part of a safety team in civil side. So if anybody does want to get in touch with Paul or Josh, we're going to share the presentation anyway. Well, we're going to share, you know, your contact details anyway. So if you can just make sure that you pass them to myself or Tony, we can make sure that they're, you know, put on our site, or I can share them on the Merseyside IOSH LinkedIn page. But we can also, are you both on LinkedIn as well?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so if people want to go on LinkedIn.
Michelle, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to, I've got another call, I'm going to have to duck out, but I just wanted to say thank you very much. I certainly enjoyed talking to you. Josh can hang around, and he knows as much about this as I do, so can answer, you know, think of some really difficult questions for him. And yeah, I just reiterate, very happy to sort of talk to people, very happy to give a demonstration, whatever really, to suit people, but really appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Bye, Paul.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Anybody else want to unmute themselves and ask any questions? I've checked the chat. A few have come in while I've been twittering away. Most people are, you know, commenting how informative it is. Anybody want to come in with a question? I'll be quiet.
Hi, Jenny here. I was just wondering, what's the shelf life of the product?
The shelf life, yes, good question. So the screening cartridges, they have a shelf life of 1 year. And then the back to lab kits have a shelf life of 2 years. So how we normally do it, we manage it through, as Paul kind of mentioned, we tailor each, you know, pricing and what we send out to each individual customer. So we would never send you out like a year's worth of supply of cartridges straight away. We do it quarterly or 6 monthly on that front. And then with the back to lab kits, you're not going to use as many because you won't be getting as many non-negatives due to the negative test.
Hopefully.
That's why they have a longer shelf life on that front.
And the lab screen testing, is that comparable to urine testing? Obviously, this is relatively newer technology, so is the preparation more expensive?
We actually believe, I mean, I'm more than happy to sort of talk costs after, but we believe it's probably a little bit cheaper, if I'm being honest, because we've got a really good relationship with LGC, that who's our lab, basically the Laboratory of Government Cannabis, who we had to start, because we had to start somewhere, so we had to actually design the technology. We worked in comparison with them first, so they're our independent lab. So yeah, when you compare us to that, we believe we're cheaper. I know some occupational health companies will charge you per drug. So say if somebody's screened for cocaine and cannabis, they had a really good night, or even if they did all four drugs on a panel, it may charge you like £30 per drug, for example. With ourselves, there's just one charge for the whole sample, no matter how many non-negatives you get on that. So yeah, again, we're comparable. I'd say maybe a little bit more affordable. Obviously, I'm biased, but yeah.
And I missed the very start of the presentation, sorry, but have you done comparisons against more traditional urine testing?
Comparisons from a cost point of view, or just?
No, from a test point of view.
Yeah, so we have to, I mean, we have to be comparable with regards to accuracy. So the screening test is 95% and upwards accurate. It has to be, otherwise we wouldn't have a product. Everybody else would go to urine or to saliva testing. So the accuracy side is completely the same. The only difference, which we believe are a benefit, is the fact that there's no special preparations with our test. Unlike urine, we've kind of touched on the sort of non-invasive nature of it as well. And with that is a massive time aspect as well. So again, if you want to do large groups of people, there's knock-on effects to managing the people administering the test, i.e. manage your health and safety advisors, whoever's doing that test, you can manage their time better. We also kind of touched on as well, having the stuff on site allows you, I know Michelle, you kind of touched on it, it also acts as a deterrent for staff if they know that there's a test there straight away that can be done. There's not, like you mentioned, that sort of 2-hour turnaround when an occupational health person comes out and you've got to wait for them on that front. So yeah, it is comparable to, you know, a urine or saliva test, obviously just from, we believe, a more sort of nicer process when doing it.
And last one, with the robustness of the test, most of the people on site wear gloves for a significant portion of the day, so we'll have very sweaty hands as a result of that. Well, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Because do you have any sort of dilution effect?
No, it's great. We want, believe it or not, we want sweaty hands. So the measurement, without trying to go outside, is we basically measure in picograms, which is like a really small amount of sample. So we like to say something, but yeah, the sweatier almost the better. So if somebody has got gloves, I didn't want to put everyone off their lunch, but if somebody's got gloves on, they take them off and they take the test immediately, that is better for the actual test, because you're getting more of a sample and you're getting that immediate sort of sweat.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. There's one question that I just saw on the chat there, Josh.
Yeah.
Somebody just asking then, I think on your form that you held up before, you had your fingerprint analysis, and you also had next to it that there was a section for alcohol testing. Someone's just asked the question, do you do both? Is it same thing or separate?
So we offer a breathalyzer. So basically companies can keep everything under the same umbrella. So it's just like an intoximeter, the same as what the police force will use. It will give you a numerical reading of how much alcohol is in that person's system. The reason we offer that is because the result's instant with a breathalyzer, so it's a lot quicker. We could do it for a fingerprint, but it would only tell you if the drug group, if the alcohol was there. It wouldn't give you a level, which is obviously, from any health and safety perspective, you want a level of how much alcohol is in somebody's system as opposed to if it's there or not. So yeah, we offer an alcohol breathalyzer as well.
Okay, thank you. Leslie, have I missed anything? Because I know that you were monitoring the chat. Do you want to, is there anything I've missed, Leslie?
No, I think you've captured them all there, Michelle.
Okay, so if there's nothing else from anybody, we'll let you go, Josh, and we open a short networking session for anybody who's still on the call who wants to ask the committee anything. So thank you so much for your time. So can you just watch your surname again, Josh, for the LinkedIn?
It's Josh, it's a bit of a long one, Josh Klein Davis, which is Davies. Okay,
Brill. It's just because you say Josh on the screen, you say in case people are trying to look for you on LinkedIn.
Yeah, Josh Klein, Klein -Davies.
Okay.
But yeah, so as Paul kind of mentioned, if you want to get in contact with us, we're more than happy to again demonstrate in more detail, and we can talk from there as well.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Josh, for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.